This time on the Plutopia podcast, the Plutopians are joined by EFF-Austin president Kevin Welch. Elon Musk's team of alleged geniuses continue to disrupt many U.S. government agencies. With that in mind, we discuss government data and Musk's impact upon democracy and the rule of law.
It all has very much the feeling of like a fishing expedition, of like they don't necessarily know what they're looking for, they're just looking. And then when they find stuff, it's like they take things out of context to justify continuing to look. I mean, if I take them at their word, they're claiming they found proof of fraud, of like, oh, there's the same persons in the system multiple times. Dead people are getting tons of money. And by the way, I am sure that is happening to a certain degree, because there's no way a system that sprawling, that old, with that much data that you can't just delete, but some of it may not be right. I'm sure to a certain extent it is happening. Hell, reports have been put out under previous administrations identifying some of this problem. But what's happening is a highly selective window narrative is being built here, combined with people who don't have the technical expertise to truly know what they're looking at.
Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm John Lebkowski, and my partner here nearby is Scoop Sweeney, and our co-host is Wendy Grossman. And we all sort of have weirdly interesting backgrounds in media and technology. And we have this podcast every week. At least we've so far been able to manage out a new one every week for an hour. And we're happy that you've joined us today when our guest will be Kevin Welch. And Kevin's come to discuss with us the DOGE that's chasing the car, I guess. Kevin is a technology guy, and he's also a cyber activist. He took my place as president of EFF-Austin, which is the only existing chapter of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is kind of a long story in itself. So Kevin has worked on the side of technology activism, but he also has worked as a technology developer. So he's got a pretty good background for this conversation, I'd say. And didn't you work in government technology at one time?
I did. I actually was one of those dreaded government employees, although I worked for the state of Texas, not the federal government. I worked as a software engineer on the salsa team at the Texas Legislative Council. They basically were kind of I'm not using my own words to describe this. This is how it was internally described. They were kind of often described as like a rock star department to get to work for. You were not working on 30-year out-of-date technology or having to code on mainframes, GASP, which the Texas Comptroller, as of 10 years ago, was still on a mainframe. Don't know if they've fixed that.
I'm
but
sure
yeah,
they probably are still.
but yeah,
And so,
basically,
let me.
yeah, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to toss in that I had a couple of decades as a state employee before I became an internet
Maven.
What is a
Thought leader?
a digital maven.
Thought leader?
That's a good one. Internet maven. I wouldn't say that about myself, but it's okay for you to say it.
Okay. But yeah, I worked on systems.
But when I worked for the state, I was a systems analyst for some time and worked with very complex technologies. And one of the things that I know about government technology is that it's complex, and it's complex partly because it is used to implement complex policies.
Mm.
And you can't just make all that stuff go away, as far as I'm concerned, right?
I would agree. Having both worked in that context and also worked in a startup context, they're very different contexts. Like, there's the famous startup Silicon Valley mantra, move fast and break things, which sometimes for a startup is actually good advice. But in the context of government software, yeah, it's not very good advice. You are implementing very complex policies that have to work 100% of the time, ideally, have to serve everyone and have to comply with the law like 100% of the time. This is not easy to do. And it is a culture where, like on our team, we had software that supported literally the legislative bill drafting process. And it was like we could not push a bug to production. We would all be fired if that ever happened. So it was like to change anything could take years to like get a major initiative done. And it's a glacial pace that people who only know startups would chafe at.
I think I'm not sure where she is right now. Danielle Citron wrote a really interesting paper called Technological Due Process, where she talked about the difficulty of translating law that humans write into code that humans write for computers to follow, and how often the computer code makes an error that is not obvious, but actually misses out some important bit of the law.
I would agree with that. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between computer languages in the law and just human languages or any form of communication. But trying to turn law into code, yeah, it's similar to any active translation, like we translating what I'm saying right now into French, where we can get the broad gist right, but there will be subtleties lost in translation. And when that's the law, and there's a subtle difference lost when you try to implement that law as code, can have serious consequences.
Yeah, I had the joy, well, maybe not, it wasn't so joyful, of working for Kaiser Permanente's California IT group, and we created their first online billing and claims system. And we were subject to HIPAA and the Sarbanes-Oxley uh, compliance, and that was my burden, was to make sure we weren't breaking any of those laws. And because back then the penalties were pretty severe, but they were really serious about the healthcare insurance portability. And one of the things that surprised me about the Musk group, the whole Social Security number thing they did. Social Security numbers back when I was doing this, that was how insurance companies identified their subscribers. They used their Social Security number. And so,
It's a key.
yeah, that was the key. And the number of social security numbers on our system was astounding, and it's used everywhere. So you know, the Musk folks did not understand how social security numbers work, I suppose, because they were saying all these things about it's all over the place. It's all these illegal people. And no, it's just one person's number appears many, many times in a system like that. Ours was a combination of mainframe and tandem nonstop computer servers. And the cleanup of that, because when HIPAA came along, they said, you've got to mask those socials because that's a number you can't be allowing out. And so we had to go in and mask all of those. And it was an astoundingly horrifying process.
Yeah, I had to salt hash all of them, I would imagine.
Right?
You have no idea how many European countries looked at the mess of Social Security and were much more, when they brought in sort of tax numbers and stuff, were much more careful about how they were used, beside about not allowing extra uses.
Yeah, Social Security numbers, like they, at the time, they were groundbreaking. They were an early attempt of the government to, essentially provide services on a mass scale for citizens with an ID number. They didn't have what we would think of as computers, but they did have computers, which were human beings combined with mechanical devices that predated a lot of what we use computers for. They
Mostly
certainly,
women.
right. And done with punch cards developed building on the work of the Jacques Loom a century earlier. But yeah, it's actually been a known thing in cybersecurity for a long time that we're stuck with social security numbers. But from the fact that you'd be blasé about their security is insane because they're already incredibly insecure. By modern standards, they were designed very poorly. Like they don't guarantee Well, this is a problem with a lot of hashing functions, but they don't guarantee no collisions. They also there's no, if somebody gets your social security number, they have it. There's no concept yet of asymmetric public-private key cryptography with a social security
And
number.
there's
Somebody
no way
has
to
it, they're you.
get a new one.
Nope.
And also, if you know enough about somebody, I think you can make a pretty good guess at what their social security number would be.
You can, because I think it's overly simplifying to say that like they're a sequential ID where they're literally rolled out. The number goes up one every time somebody's born. It's a little more complicated than that. But it is broadly true that if you know the first digit of somebody's social security number, you do have a certain sense of they may have been born around these years.
Yeah. Well, John and I have uh, social security numbers that map to our hometown. That's how they were assigned. And
Hmm.
I noticed going to an estate sale of really old items that a lot of them had the social security number of the original owner inscribed upon it. But the cops used to say, well, to prevent someone stealing and reselling your stuff, get an etching device and attach your social security number to whatever it was. It was on car parts and silverware, just ridiculous stuff. And that went on for a long time.
One of my friends moved to Kentucky and was absolutely horrified that her driver's license number was now her social security number. Yeah, they had to change that after that. But
That's kind of scary.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get into kind of what's happening right now
Yeah.
with in the federal government. We have a new, I guess it's an agency. I mean, it hasn't been authorized in any clear way other than the president saying, go and do this. So they call it the Department of Government Efficiency, which is abbreviated DOGE, DOGE, and of course, Elon Musk, who is the Department of Government Security, really has already has used that label Doge for his Dogecoin, his cryptocurrency.
Well, and I
He
guess
he does like to reuse labels, I guess.
well,
I don't
actually,
think
nitpick,
Dogecoin
it's
is
not
actually his.
his cryptocurrency. He likes to promote it, but it was
It's
actually
one that he
started.
likes. It's one that he
Yeah.
likes. Okay, yeah,
It
I
was
got that.
started as a
But
joke. That's the really funny thing. It was actually started as a joke.
well, I think the Department of Government Efficiency may have been started as a joke too. A
Well,
really
its name
bad
is a
joke.
troll, actually, because technically the way they're trying to hack the law to justify this is they're claiming it's not a new department. They're claiming they renamed an existing department, the Digital Services Department, which was made a decade ago under Obama to try to clean up the Obamacare website debacle. They're
Uh,
claiming, oh, this is that department. We just renamed it and changed their mission.
Yeah, well, one of
okay.
the people who actually worked for the U.S. Digital Service is a guy I follow on Mastodon, and he was fired Friday night. He was one of their top security guys.
Okay, well, so, but I want to make this point. So, what they're supposedly doing now is they're seizing the tech systems of these various government agencies. They're getting their hands on the technology, and it's like there's, I think, 5 or 6 guys who are around 20 something years old, very young guys.
Yeah,
Um,
little
who
young.
have, as far as we know, it's extremely unlikely that they have any training on the systems that they're dealing with. They may be smart guys technically, but I mean, I'm trying to think like, how do you explain this to somebody who doesn't really know much about technology? Uh, when we say that these systems are very, very complex, one of the things we're saying is that they can really be screwed up if somebody blunders into them, not knowing what they're doing with sufficient permissions to do damage. And this is the case that we have right now, is that we have people who it's extremely unlikely that they have any sense of what they're dealing with. They also don't understand the government agencies. There's no way that they can can hope to have perceived exactly what the agency is doing and why things are set up the way they're set up. Yet they're coming in and they're making decisions about, they're making decisions to get rid of people and to get rid of functionalities and they're pretty much just cleaning stuff out without any idea of what they're doing. They have no
Yeah.
idea what they're breaking. They're just klutzing through. And it's like, well, we're really smart guys. We kind of get all this. You don't. There's no way that you can get the complexities of even one subsection of one department of one agency could be beyond what a person could grasp with a couple of months of study. So
Yeah.
how is it that they can expect that they can blunder through and fix the government and clean it up in a way that won't be anything other than disastrous? Do I sound upset? I'm upset.
Yeah,
A
there.
bit. Your point's well taken, and yes, and I mean, so just to give an example of how somebody could naively think they understand how a system's working and they really don't, is because mind you, and I'm sure they probably have gone, oh look, we've got all the source code here, and look, we even asked an AI to analyze it. We know how it all works. But just to give an example how that might not reveal everything, well, what if this system is deployed in a deployment context where it's writing certain things to a database, and that database is actually, the records in it are used to queue off another process on an entirely different server running an entirely separate code repo, that because you didn't go look at the server logs and see, well, what IPs are calling into this system, and like, it'd be very easy to think that you're changing something nothing else depends on, and surprise, you broke this other system way over there you didn't even know was there and depended on this.
They broke a system that they really didn't understand when they fired 30% of the people at Pantex in Amarillo. Those are the folks that are responsible for nuclear warheads. They're the only people that I know of that's their job, and 30% of them were fired, and now they wanted to unfire them because they realized they shouldn't do that because there's no one to replace them. Musk's people know nothing about nuclear warheads, and maybe they can spell it, but that just is insane, because this is happening in one of the most conservative red parts of Texas, the Panhandle. Amarillo is very red, and they got rid of a lot of workers right there. So this is going to be happening in a lot of red states, and I don't think they understand that's going to come back and bite them in the ass, because these people are going to go, well, we voted for you, and why did you get rid of my job?
I read that on Saturday night they started firing people at the FAA. If you're
Yeah,
worried
I
about
heard
going
about that.
anywhere. But
Yeah.
my favorite story actually was that there was some claim that they were finding all these 150-year-olds who were getting Social Security payments. And apparently the origin of that is that something to do with COBOL, and if it doesn't have a date, it autofills 1845.
Yeah,
So,
well, if it doesn't have a date, it's a zero, and zero gets translated.
I will actually, I kind of wondered if that'd come up and actually wanted to talk a little bit about that detail, because so I've seen that going around a lot as an explanation for why they were
Yeah,
claiming
that's
all
the
these
Toshi
people were getting
post.
social. Yeah. Well, so actually, John, can you give me context? Like, is Toshi somebody who really knows COBOL? Because I actually started being
Not from
skeptical
what I could
whether
see.
it's
No, I don't think they
anecdote.
get. Well,
Yeah.
they're talking about uh, they're ta- from what I could gather just from doing research, they're describing more of a Unix system than a COBOL system. They really kind of didn't
Mm.
know what they were talking about. And the zero date probably would have been in 1970 and not in, what did they say, 1875 or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that what they were saying was incorrect, but the point behind it,
Right.
that these are guys who are interpreting data from systems that they don't understand is, I mean, I'm sure that's correct, even though the actual explanation that they gave for a particular thing was probably not correct.
That I'd broadly agree with that, though I had to appreciate the irony that we're dealing with. They're so inexperienced to know what they're doing that weirdly enough, now everybody is primed to believe stories about examples of their incompetence that may itself represent people not actually knowing what they're talking about. Because admittedly,
Exactly.
and we run into the issue here of COBOL is an ancient old language at this point. Even if you code for a living like me, you're intellectually dishonest if you claim you know much about how it works. And so I saw the claim going around like, I can't say that's wrong, but also I can't say that's right. And there's certain things about the claim that I'm like, even my understanding of old languages like Scheme or Fortran, I'm like, doesn't sound quite right. It actually sounded very much like the claim an AI would make, where it like conflated a bunch of things that were sort of true, but was not actually quite right, like mixing up date epochs with date parsing. And that, yeah, the nearest I could track it down was there was a COBOL specification from 2004 that did reference this 1875 date epoch, which mostly comes up in scientific computing measurement context. But from what I could gather, it was just reference. First of all, it's not from the original standard of COBOL. It's from one from 2004, and it's actually been removed from the most recent 2019 standard. It was just put in there as a suggested reference date to harmonize dates that may disagree about what the date is. It wasn't equivalent to Unix time or Excel time of we're going to count milliseconds from this fixed date. So yeah, I don't think that explains what it was trying to explain, but I do think the broad point, the very fact that I don't know for sure, I think does correctly point out the broad point of this is a very ancient technology that there's no way a 20-year-old fully understands how it works.
You know, it's sort of like you get rolled in to get brain surgery, and then you find out that the surgeon who's going to do your brain surgery is an orthopedic surgeon. You're not going to feel too good about that. I mean, these guys may be really, really smart with, something like JSON and JavaScript and that sort of thing. But what do they know about COBOL?
Not
Like
much. And I
nothing.
mean, in fairness, I'll say at least one of
You,
them is legit really accomplished. I actually had heard of his accomplishment a few years ago. One of them is the kid who managed to use machine learning to decipher the Vesuvius scrolls and read them. Like one of them
That's
is
right.
actually a genius, but still doesn't mean
but
he
did
knows
he do that
COBOL.
with COBOL?
Yeah.
No, he
Yeah,
didn't. He did it with
exactly.
Python, of
But the,
Yeah.
but
course.
the other
Yeah,
thing,
there
the
you
other
go.
thing I wanted to say about COBOL is that there's a kind of attitude that these government systems are so antiquated they must be very wasteful anyway. And that's actually not going to be universally true. There's going to be a lot of them that are old but are very functional and very efficient because they were written at a time when there
Right.
was less computing power available and it didn't use so much energy. And there is no reason to get rid of something that works just because you think it's cooler to have something new.
That's right.
If it
And I
ain't
mean,
broke, don't fix it.
and there's a lot of stuff in there that might seem wasteful that they may never had experience. Like, for instance, there's a concept in computing called fault tolerance. And fault tolerance will literally sometimes duplicate data two, three, four times. You might think, oh, well, it's wasteful why it's doing that. It's literally there such that even if the data gets corrupted, you still have your data. It's not there by accident.
Yeah, I worked on that kind of system, the tandem system back then. Tandem mid-range was fault tolerant. It was used by most of the banks because it was very hard to uh, go down and cause a system outage. During many of the outages we experienced on the Kaiser network, the mainframes, they all just died. The Windows servers, they melted down 1,200 of them in a power spike, and we just rocked along because Tandem said, "Oh, that's okay." We had mirror disks going everywhere, so if one server went down, there was a mirror disk. It would just would be activated almost immediately. So you can have fault tolerant systems, but most of them out there aren't.
Right. And because a lot of contexts, it's not necessary. But in certain contexts, like, I don't know, Social Security, where like it's really, really important everybody gets their money and gets the exact right amount of money, you have to build a system where if a bit just being transmitted via UDP TCP flips and says the wrong thing, you have to have the means to go, that's not right. So you have to be using things like error correcting curves and whatnot because it literally can't fail. It's not like Facebook, where if an obscure page of the site has a rendering error, it's not the end of the world. But these systems, it actually can be the end of the world.
For somebody anyway.
Right.
Yeah. And the other, so there's another point here, which is, and this is kind of like, it's particularly today, it's come up as a big deal that um, they're wanting to look at taxpayer data at IRS. And I guess the idea is, are they going to be looking for tax fraud? I mean, what is it that they're really supposed to be looking at? This is actually, this kind of takes me around to another point. I'm not 100% clear what they're looking for. And I don't think other people are too, but I know that I had a discussion with someone about how, well, what I was saying is that I don't have any evidence that there's any intention to try to stop or reduce Social Security payments to retirees, right? And they say, oh, well, no, they'll do that too. They'll do that too. And I said, well, there's no evidence of it. So he said, well, how about this? And he shows me an article, I think it was in Semaphore, that says that apparently someone who knows what's going on, who is anonymous, said that Social Security is coming up pretty quickly on their list and they're going to go into the Social Security Administration to look for what? Are they going to be looking for employee inefficiency? Are they going to look for programming inefficiency? Are they going to I mean, what are they looking for exactly, and how
If
are they doing their analysis? And how can they do an analysis that determines, for instance, that an employee is not being sufficiently productive? They laid off a bunch of people, for instance, who had really stellar job reviews, and they sent them notices that said that they were underperforming. But none of their evaluations show that they're underperforming. So how are they making this decision? It sounds like what they're doing is that they're just going through blundering along, just cutting stuff out without giving it much thought, without doing any analysis, without meeting with anyone who has actual expertise in what they're cutting. I mean, that it's just kind of like uh, a bull raging through a china shop.
Well, and it all has very much the feeling of like a fishing expedition of like they don't necessarily know what they're looking for. They're just looking, and then when they find stuff, it's like they take things out of context to justify continuing to look. I mean, if I take them at their word, they're claiming they found proof of fraud, of like, oh, there's the same persons in the system multiple times. Dead people are getting tons of money. And by the way, I am sure that is happening to a certain degree because there's no way a system that sprawling, that old, with that much data that you can't just delete, but some of it may not be right. I'm sure to a certain extent it is happening. Hell, reports have been put out under previous administrations identifying some of this problem. But what's happening is a highly selective window narrative is being built here, combined with people who don't have the technical expertise to truly know what they're looking at. And yeah, it all feels very much like, to be blunt, it feels very much like a cop saying, I smelled weed in your car. Do you mind if I have a look in your vehicle? It's fishing to find other stuff, potentially, I don't know, employees who they suspect might not be sufficiently loyal or whatever, and they have to find the evidence to prove it because they don't actually have any evidence yet.
Yeah, their next fishing expedition is into the IRS taxpayer data. And, you can file this under, wacky conspiracy theories. Maybe Musk wants to look at Donald Trump's taxpayer data and then have some really serious leverage to say, shut up, Donald, and leave me alone. I'm the new president. That's a conspiracy theory, but it's not too far off.
Well, that actually touches on a point I wanted to make, which is that people, at one point, people were saying, oh, well, it looks like the Treasury Department was saying, oh, they only have read-only access. Like that makes it sort of okay. But actually, one of the big dangers is that they're given free reign to read the data, which means they can copy it.
Right. All of it means if they don't have write, it just means they can't edit that master copy. You have
Right.
read access. This is a point I always love to make to people, which is if I don't care how much you've secured the data, the instant it is in my screen buffer so that I can see it, I can grab it and do stuff with it. It might be annoying and inefficient, but it's not secure anymore. I have access to it now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
use a
and the
screen
point is,
scraper.
there's a lot somebody like Elon Musk might want to do with the collected data of a huge pile of Americans. I mean, he's got an AI to train, and he's got,
Well,
whatever
and
else.
this gets into like one of my broad philosophical things about like why something like privacy is important, because you'll see people saying like, well, if these people are actually corrupt, who cares about their privacy, and we're learning all this stuff. And I'm sitting here going, the truth is all of us have something that could be used as pressure on us to make us do unethical things. So yes, sometimes bad actors get away with stuff because of privacy. But if you don't treat it as nobody has a right to look at this stuff, yes, you might uncover some wrongdoing, but you also create a world where nobody can actually act with integrity or higher interest in mind. Anybody who knows their screws has turned them into a puppet to do whatever they want. And you can't run a society once you get to that point.
The line I used to use was, people would say, oh, I have nothing to hide. And I'd say, well, fine. Do you want your bank statements to arrive on the backs of postcards? And that usually turned off most people.
Yeah, and the other one I want to point out is you have nothing to hide right now. People in charge change.
Well, here's another thing. The Doge website has already been hacked
Oh yeah,
and
that was
sensitive
fun.
data was leaked. I mean, they got hands on who knows what kind of sensitive data. So these guys can't even protect the data that they are what shall I say? Uh, I want to say they're stealing it. I mean, there was an intelligence officer that referred to this as a significant data breach, the
Oh
Doge
no, it
thing.
it is like actually that site, no joke, classified data from the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, got reposted on that site. For those who don't know what the NRO is, it's one of our infamous three-letter agencies like the FBI, CIA, NSA. They're specifically in charge of all the spy satellites. So yeah, they leaked that onto the Doge site. And as I'll say, when they did get hacked, I dug into the architecture of that site a little bit because I myself was curious, what the hell did they build here? And I got to tell you, for so-called coding geniuses running a secure government website, it was amazingly quickly, shoddily thrown together. It was like the sort of thing that would have been acceptable for a startup proof of concept, not for a major government website. Like, for instance, Doge.gov, that is just a DNS alias of a Cloudflare Pages website. Like the real site ends, and I forget the name, but like I could actually share it if you're interested, because they leaked the real name of the site in a session cookie here. So I was able to track down the real site, something
Oh, interesting.
pages.dev. But yeah, so the real site's just a hosted Cloudflare page. It's not even AWS, just like a quick and dirty throw a website up on a cloud provider. And um
And
and the actual vulnerability is staggering. Apparently, the way it was hacked is they literally were not, if you did a put request to their API, there was no authentication check of any kind. Anyone could put to the API and put a record into the database. Anyone. Like
I
that's
wanted to point out,
the sort of thing a web programmer would, in the first 2 to 3 years of their career, have already learned you don't do that.
Yeah, and that page I just put up said that they have a page there to show how much money they're saving, and they have had this message up for a couple of weeks saying that receipts are coming over the weekend, and we haven't seen anything yet. So,
Also, that site is
uh,
also actually just a mirror of the Twitter feed. Like, the Twitter feed is the source of truth, to the point that actually the website's canonical tag straight up says the DOGE website is a duplicate of the data found on Twitter, and that Twitter is the real site.
I know you don't mean Twitter. I'm sure you mean X.
See,
Oh.
what I think ought to be happening is that the US government should be setting up its own, if maybe not Mastodon, but its own Fediverse instance. And everything that comes from it should be authenticated because it comes from that server. And then and then there'd be many ways of accessing the feed from it.
Oh, look, an actually sensible suggestion to modernize and disrupt government based in reality.
But the reality at the moment is that Musk wants X to become the only official government channel.
Oh, and I mean, if you follow all his ambitions and everything he said, he wants it to also replace all banking. He basically wants it to be very much like China's like Weibo or WeChat. And he said it. He wants an
Yeah,
everything app he
yeah,
controls.
yeah, yeah. I don't want to do my banking with him.
I don't really want to either.
There's a lot of things that people don't want to do right now.
But the good
Some
news is
people
I
are
don't
a
think
little
bank,
nervous about eating eggs. Some
Well,
people don't want to fly in airplanes.
but I don't think banks want to channel the banks through him either.
no, I don't think they do. That'd be
Well,
a threat to their own power.
Well, their own power and also the security of bank accounts.
That too. It can both be true that the banks cynically want their own power, but also, yes, they are more right about the security of the transactions here.
how would he have access to bank information? Is that funneled through the federal government somehow?
No,
Well, the
there's an
main
actually this is an actual real British thing called open banking, which the government passed a law that requires banks to open up some way to access account data for third parties, and you can authorize a third party to access your bank account.
So opening
well,
up a back door to the system.
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure how it works,
and
but
I mean, I will say that, there have been, I forget which government office it was, like some subsidiary of the Treasury, I'm forgetting what, but there was a few years ago some proposals went around. Once again, I will call out something I'm concerned by regardless of which party in power is doing it. There were some proposals under the Biden administration that were kind of steps to de-anonymizing bank accounts, like letting the government have some access to them for illegal activity. And I was very concerned when they were proposing that. Not that the current regime is any better, which is what their followers fall for. It's just as bad, if not worse. But yeah, there's people in government who don't like that your bank account is private, actually.
well, open banking was intended to increase competition. It wasn't about giving government access. There is a separate proposal
Right.
where the Department of Work and Pensions would very much like to rummage through everyone's bank accounts in order to claw back money if they spot cases of fraud. And nobody likes this idea very much except for the Department of Work and Pensions.
Yeah, it's similar to like usually only law enforcement loves encryption backdoors, but they don't ever give up on it.
I was just thinking about, I'm sure you all heard that $80 million was sent to New York. I think it was a FEMA allocation it was funds related to migrant management, I think, immigrant
Mm.
management. And someone in government, I guess it was Christy Nome, decided that that money should not have been released, so they just took it back. And they didn't tell New York they were telling it back. So suddenly New York they saw basically that $80 million was missing and they had a 79 point something million dollar overdraft.
Yeah, I
And the
wondered
thing is
about the
that,
mechanics of that. How did they actually do that?
yeah, I was wondering about that too. I mean,
Does it work
it
like when
sounds
I
like
dispute a
there's some,
transaction with my credit card? Because, in that case, the bank will pull it back for me. But I'm like, how does it work when it's a government check and it's that large?
they're calling it a clawback. And certainly they did send the funds through some kind of funds transfer. So they had some means to recall the funds. I don't know how that works.
Yeah, banks can do
And of
that.
course, and the key point in a lot of this is that these are funds that were congressionally authorized, and that, I mean, there's really no right to take that money back. New York is, of course, going to sue the federal government. So then you have all of these lawsuits being filed for people who've lost their jobs and funds that have been frozen and so forth. And you then have a government who says, "Well, we're going to get those judges impeached that are freezing, that are ruling against us, and we're just going to ignore their directives."
Well, the
And this gets to the point of what I think is what they like to call a constitutional crisis.
Well, they've
Well,
gotten the mayor of New York City involved by dropping his his corruption charges in exchange for him promising to help the Trump folks do their dirty deeds.
yeah,
Is it a
it's
different timeline? I mean,
Say what?
can we just shift to a different timeline entirely? I don't like this one.
I mean, the fundamental thing that even we are in a constitutional crisis, as John said, that like what I just really worry is we're getting to a point where there's no ability to run a society consistently or plan for the future because we're in this weird world where like people make agreements and then they break them and claw back the money just because they can, and the normal mechanisms that would have arbitrated the dispute and said no, you can't do that, like nobody's listening to them anymore. So you very rapidly get to a world where like we can't function because nobody trusts anyone. Like now, if I'm New York City, why am I ever going to give money to the federal government when I know they might just take money from me at any time?
Well, the other part of it is that nobody outside the U.S. trusts the U.S. European countries are already sort of talking about, we have to go on as though the U.S. is just not one of our allies, and that's a really big.
Because that's true. I mean, the
Yeah,
U.S. is not one of their
I'm
allies.
not mad at them. They're behaving
no.
logically based on, unfortunately, what's happening.
Well, yeah, because even if 4 years from now you shift to a different government and they rescind Trump's orders and reinstate Biden's orders, you can't trust that the next guy isn't going to upend everything. So, I mean,
America
even in the
built so
UK,
much cultural capital that our citizens and their voters and who we elected was fundamentally reliable, that people felt they could trust it. And now that trust is shattered, such that, yes, even if we kick the bums out, it's going to take generations to rebuild the trust we've squandered.
Okay, I have something that is related to that. Let me do a screen share here real quickly. I'm sure you're conversant with this.
I'm very familiar with this subreddit. It's
Yeah,
it's it's
leopards
good for
ate
a bit of
my face.
Schadenfreude sometimes. Yep.
Yeah. And the point here is it's like I never dreamed that leopards would eat my face, so yeah, I've been hanging out with leopards, and in fact they ate your face. Uh, this is all about people who voted for the current administration and are now finding out that they're going to be devastated, as this guy says, by some action that the administration is taking. And it's pretty interesting to, if you start mining for these things, if you start looking for them, there's posts all over the place from or about people, farmers, for instance, who are going to be devastated because their their whole framework has been kind of undermined and subverted. Uh,
You had
Aren't
farmers
there
who
also,
Wendy?
literally, oh, sorry.
sorry, aren't there also lots of people, but aren't there also a lot of people who are sort of saying this is what we elected him to do and he's doing it, yay?
Oh, there are. I
Yeah.
like, I saw one person I got into a debate with. I tried to keep the politics out of it and just focus purely on the privacy security issues going on. But I couldn't get through to her, and the basic vibe I got was basically just, this is how I put it to somebody else who was like despairing, trying to get it through to people, where you're dealing with people who have like wanted to for maybe their whole life, some of them have wanted to cut or downsize or remove big parts of the federal government. And they're so angry and frustrated that they never were able to accomplish that through voting that they're now so excited they're finally getting it done. They don't care it's illegal and they don't care about any of the collateral damage. They're just like, I tried to get rid of this thing I hate through voting, and those corrupt politicians never got rid of it or listened to what I wanted. So, yeah, I'm happy it's finally happening and don't care about any of these other concerns like people will get hurt or die. I just want that finally gone because they just feel like democracy never listened to them. And they're like, fine, now we're doing it our way. Hard
Well,
to get through to
democracy
somebody
doesn't
who's,
listen to anybody, does it?
no, it doesn't. And I mean, it's hard to get through to somebody who's fundamentally in a very emotional place like that, of just like, I want this and I don't care what I have to do to make it happen or who gets hurt to make it happen.
Yeah, I hate to play the old guy card, but I was a journalist back when uh, Richard Nixon took over the government, and they were doing a lot of extremely, unconstitutional, you know, uh, actions, and he was taken to task by his own party, which was today is unheard of. They had courageous, patriotic Republicans in Congress who finally said, you can't keep doing this. We're going to kick you out of office. And that's been tried in our time here. And there are no courageous Republicans left except just a very small number. So until someone gets fed up with or, you know, grows some courage, there's not much chance that anyone in the government is going to say, no, Trump, you can't do this.
Well,
And
Mitch McConnell did vote against RFK Jr. as health secretary.
I just say too
Yeah.
little too late to that. But
Yeah.
He
um,
voted against Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence too.
he's voted
I
against a number
mean,
of them, but he had the ability to actually get the dude impeached after January 6th, and he did not. So this mess is on
well,
him.
not only that,
I
I mean, he built this city. I mean, this is a thing that he built,
Yeah.
and I think he has this kind of. If you see pictures of him now, he has a kind of look of horror on his face most of the time, and I think
mm,
he's beginning to realize what he's done.
Yeah. He's on the way out, but
Mitch McConnell always, I mean, he's always had, for some years now, he's had this kind of Walking Dead look about him anyway. But, you know, he'll,
he promoted hacking the rules to their breaking point to win, and then he's shocked that if you keep doing that, it might eventually blow up in your face. I just, I worry you have this treasure trove of immensely sensitive financial and personal data on all Americans. And I'm just like, what happens when you feed all that data into some AI model, which they're going to do? And like, essentially, once you've done that, you can literally automate mass identity theft and fraud. Like, you could literally have AI powered bots opening credit cards in people's names. They have everyone's social security number. They have their bank account and routing numbers because of their IRS checks. They have other sensitive information on them, demographic information. I'm like, you literally you combine that with convincing deep fakes of audio and video of people. I'm like, literally, we're going to have AI digital clones doing mass identity theft fraud. And I know that may sound alarmist conspiracy theory, but I'm like, the tech is already there, the morals are not there, and they have access to the data. This is something that somebody with no ethics or morals could do with this stuff.
So
You
this
sound
kind of
like you
leads
don't
me.
trust Elon Musk.
No, but this leads me to a broader question. You know, is did we miss a bet? You know, EFF and EFF-Austin and all the other sort of digital rights groups. Did we miss a bet in not insisting from the beginning that governments should not create these databases, that people should retain ownership of their own data and supply it as needed in a more user controlled way?
I
And
mean,
because
one could argue we're playing catch up. Yes.
we do have the tech to build something like that, but we never, you know, we're running around sort of asking for broadband and network neutrality and all these other things, but nobody really paid attention to the amount of data that governments were compiling. And even in Europe, where you have data protection, there's a lot of carve outs for government because Europeans tend to trust their governments more than Americans do.
Yeah. I mean, and admittedly, I'll say that, EFF, is actually one of many orgs suing DOGE right now. And I mean, EFF, especially in the context of law enforcement, has been calling out this mass data collection for a long time. But you do raise a point of that some of the more benign accepted forms of mass data gathering, like Social Security or financial information. We do maybe have to have a reckoning of like, were we too permissive even there? Though, admittedly, many of these systems predate the founding and creation of orgs like EFF. Social Security have been
Right.
around for 60 years and in computer systems for 30 plus years by the time EFF came along. It's sort of a case of you're trying to patch which is already in existence. But I mean, yes, this is when you look at like people like Tim Berners-Lee with like their solid proposals, yeah, this is kind of the idea that we eventually need to get to a place where we have essentially kind of much like we have now have things like password managers, you have some kind of digital archive protocol vault that is your personal data. And all corporations and governments have to ask for your explicit permission to have any kind of access to that data and under strict terms because
Various projects in the UK call it personal data store.
yeah, or personal data sovereignty. But like, yeah, because I think we're very rapidly seeing that it's like if you're not in the driver's seat on this stuff, well, it's the same thing whenever I've encountered like, apologists for the NSA. Usually when a Democrat is president of, they're just like, well, they won't abuse that power. And I'm like, you've still created this dangerous failure point in the system. And now we're seeing the horrific consequences of you've concentrated all this power, and now people who are not philosopher kings are in charge of all that power.
Yeah, I mean, I've said for years that, today's government may be benign, but the next government may not be. And I've been accused of being paranoid sometimes.
And to be clear, it is, once again, I'm not both sides in this, but it is a bipartisan problem. Like we have Democrats panicking at how much power the executive branch has, even though their own lawmakers ceded power from Congress to the executive when their presidents were in charge.
Yeah. I think in the UK too, there has been kind of a pulling of power toward the center. And but Parliament has retained its sovereignty much better so far than Congress has. When Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament and somebody got it to the Supreme Court here, they ruled immediately that it was illegal, and Parliament was recalled within a few days.
There's a different dynamic with the UK Parliament where, because the Prime Minister's not directly elected by the people, he's elected from the body of the party the people elect. He's much more directly answerable to the whims of that party, where if the power brokers in the party don't like him, they'll can him in a second because he doesn't directly interact with voter attitudes at all.
See also Liz Truss and her 49 days in office. Yes.
And I mean, it's tricky because on the one hand, for a long time, I was of the mind that, well, the way the UK does it is less democratic. Let the people directly elect the prime minister like we do the president. But then we see the downsides of allowing that, where if the president promotes a cult of personality, well, then it puts a lot of leverage over Congress that wouldn't otherwise exist.
I hope nobody has to fly.
Yeah.
Fly or
That's really, I think that will really be the thing, that if planes start dropping out of the sky with, if that being unable to trust the air traffic control system would paralyze the country.
and stay away
Well,
from the chicken.
and people start dying because their food safety has become so lax, and water safety,
Yeah, but we won't know because the government sites aren't publishing any of the data. It's very, very hard to cover up a plane crash.
And the thing
Yeah,
I
it's
really
true.
worry about is these people are trapped in such propaganda narratives that even when these systems start catastrophically failing, they'll blame other things. Like they'll say, oh, well, the plane's crashing or because we have to root out those incompetent employees the past administration allowed in the name of equity. And it's just like, I'm just like, I don't know. The cynic in me is like, it could get really, really bad, and these people are not going to snap out of it and still blame things that are not the cause.
Well,
I,
fortunately,
I,
we have Boeing for that.
well, I think the birds are the chickens are learning to fly, and they're flying up in front of these aircraft. And wait, am I sounding a bit
You are
musky?
familiar with the Birds Aren't Real subreddit, aren't you?
No, but I should go check it out.
They're all drones. They're government spy drones. There's no such thing as birds. I don't know
That
where you heard that or
I
believe
think
that.
that started several years ago as a joke on Twitter, because I remember
It did, but the actual problem is the tech has advanced to the point you can have drones that from a distance look like a bird. So what started as a joke is actually quite possible now.
Well, I'm going to fly off and hide somewhere. Okay,
Oh,
thanks.
well, we'll have one. Nothing ever ends. Just remember that.
Oh yeah, that's true.
I don't know. We got some nuclear powers who are getting pretty annoyed.
We
Well,
had a good run. I've enjoyed our time here.
it's
All
okay.
right.
I do want to mention one more thing. There's an asteroid headed for Earth, and they're starting to think that it's going to hit. And it's supposed to hit in, I think, 6 years, maybe
2032. And may I just say, as an
7 years.
supporter of the giant meteor party, I'm very excited about our increased electoral chances here.
Four of those years, Trump will be in office, decimating any potential organizational response to this particular asteroid. So I think we're screwed.
Well, it's not a planet killer. It's not big enough for that. But if it did land right on a major city, it would wipe out that entire major city.
It's time to write that novel that you wanted to fit in before you died, I guess.
I better get
You
it.
got to get to it. The clock's ticking.
Well, we are at the end of our hour. And here I am thinking, there's probably a lot more we could have said. And we could have gone off into a whole thing about the resistance that's forming. And maybe we'll talk about that later. But really appreciate everybody showing up. And I think this has been a great, incredibly spooky conversation. And let's all keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. Let's hope we'll wake up and it was all a dream.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.